Seems like we already have quite a few people on the line. So welcome. We'll give it another minute or two for people to dial in. Thank you for making time, everyone. I know this is the final week for most people before the New Year break. So very much appreciate you joining the call. For the inaugural work group meeting, I was thinking that we would have a pretty basic agenda to cover some of the key current and future steps in the project. But before we get started, I'll just put up our antitrust policy notice. We show this at the beginning of every meeting. And if you have any questions, you can go to the Linux Foundation website or contact our counsel on this matter. So here's my proposed agenda. We cover the project status, goals of this work group. We talk a little bit about we talk about next steps. So let's kick it off with the project status. The most important thing, of course, is the simplest and largest thing, the question of where are we at with the ISO publication of our standard. The answer is we're in the database on publication. We are due to move into availability for download on the ISO website in the next few hours. I was just talking with ISO and they said they expect to have completed that process by around 3 a.m. Geneva time. So I think that's about 2 or 3 hours ahead of where we are right now. Adjacent to that, as of course, as ISO makes this available on their website, the project will be doing various PR. So we're queued up in Press Newswire with press releases in a lot of languages. So we're going live with Chinese traditional and simplified, Japanese, Korean, and German today, alongside English. And you can see that when it comes to the business sectors we're targeting, we're going very broad. And again, with companies, with countries, we're going quite broad as well. This varies a little language to language. For instance, our Chinese press release goes to China, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Taiwan. But what you can expect is a significant raised awareness of the project. Today, we're announcing two things. One is the ISO release, and the second one is that Toyota is the first company to formally announce conformance of the ISO standard. Well done to the team at Toyota. We will have other releases this week. We have membership announcements, partnership announcements, and board member announcements. We just had a call for our global work teams a few hours ago where we were just briefly that one of the announcements on Thursday will be Cisco's announcement of their conformance to the ISO standard as well. So lots happening there. The OpenChain project website has had a significant overview to help people find their way around. Nowadays, we're very much front and center. Our current standard, OpenChain 2.1, is functionally identical to ISO 5230, which is also functionally identical to OpenChain 2.0. Just diving into that super briefly, OpenChain 2.0 was released in April 2019, and that standard was fully baked. We didn't have any changes to that in terms of the intent or the requirements. However, when we were submitting to ISO, we had to adopt their formatting and approach. So that's what we call OpenChain 2.1. And what's published by ISO is identical to OpenChain 2.1. You can get OpenChain 2.1 on our website, or you can go and get ISO 5230 in a few hours as soon as they put it on their website. But whatever you do, they have the same requirements. And that means that if someone comes to the OpenChain website and decides to adopt our standard, they can use our self-certification. I'll just sign in here with a test account. to self-certify to OpenChain 2.1 or ISO 5230. We have got our website available in English right now, but the self-certification to OpenChain 2.1 is available as of today in English, German, Japanese, Korean, and simplified and traditional Chinese. Later this week, you will also find translations into other languages, such as French, Italian, and Spanish. This will allow, of course, our global community to access and answer questions related to OpenChain conformance easily. As a side note, we also make available the ability for people to download these questions as PDF as a checklist if they so wish. Okay, pausing right there. We have then the general website ready for everyone with OpenChain 2.1 or ISO 5230. We have self-certification available in multiple languages, and that corpus of languages will grow. We also have our partner network, so that's various partners around the world who can provide commercial services. Physical locations are listed on this map, but their coverage is global. So you'll find a lot of global firms such as PwC in our partner network. And that's if people want to have independent assessment or third-party certification, as opposed to simply doing self-certification, or if they need assistance in other areas of open source compliance management. Nothing else is changing. So for the OpenChain project, we will still be developing the standard. We will still maintain our corpus of reference knowledge. We will still have all of our community activities. The most important point is really that we're gaining the ISO number, but our processes and our approach is battle tested. And if someone wants to be part of what we do, they just do what they always did. Join our webinars, join our global work team calls, our mailing lists, and so on. And to that point, we have a lot of active work in areas like our specification. We have Mark Giese on the line today. Hey, Mark, who has led our specification development from the beginning and continues to be available through the global work team calls and our specification mailing list for future questions, ideas, and suggestions. Mark, congratulations on us getting to the release of 2.1 and the ISO standard. Huge win there for you. I think that's about 5 years of effort in total, right?
Well, if anybody had more of a burden, it would be you, just getting it over the line. But yeah, it was a group effort of over 200 people contributing. So yeah, it feels great.
And thank you for your kind words. It's certainly something you've been waiting for. We've had a lot of feedback from the industry that people want to put OpenChain into their procurement cycles, into their procurement contracts, negotiations, and having this ISO number really helps us with that. Now, one thing that might be of interest to those of you who are relatively new to where we're at is under resources, OpenChain has a list of some key materials like case studies and training slides. But we link out to a much bigger corpus of material. So we have on GitHub a reference material repository. And you can navigate it just like files and folders. But basically, it's around 1,000 documents, ranging from policy templates to checklists to Kanban workflows. The intent of this reference library, which is cited on our website under reference, is to provide examples of how people met the OpenChain requirements. We don't require people to use something like the OpenChain official policy template for 2.1, but it is available if people need inspiration and ideas. One of the tabs I had open here was just that under checklists, we have our self-certification questionnaire. In case people don't want to use the web app for self-certification, they want to download a physical document or work offline, they can get the self-certification questionnaire, which goes through all of the points of self-certification questions. And they can get that as a PDF, or as usual, they can get the source code, in other words, in this case, a Word document, where they can take that information and incorporate it into their own material. And so it is throughout the project. Right. Dashing into the next part, goals and activities for North America. Just a pause here. Is anyone new to OpenChain on the line? All right.
Well,
if there's no one,
no, I think that we're all, there's a few of us, we're newly a partner, Hamilton Brook, and we're grateful and we're excited about working with OpenChain and helping promote the adoption of OpenChain throughout the software industry. So it's great, and we're looking forward to being more active and helping in any way we can to further the adoption of the ISO standards. So thank you, and it's great all that you do. I mean, I've been on some of the calls, but it's just amazing that all the time and effort and how the intricacy and everything that you do is just very much appreciated, and it's great, and it's super to be a part of this. Thank you.
Oh, it's great to work with you as well, Giovanna. So I think now HBSR has been a partner for a couple of weeks, and it's good to have you in our fold. Our partner program has been growing relatively rapidly around the world. So we're just about to do some new partner announcements this week, and probably a few just to kick off January. We see a lot of requests from the marketplace, so user companies asking for infrastructure support. And some of that support happens inside the user companies helping each other, and some of it's via the partners. And that dovetails neatly with the goals and activities discussion. So we have work groups in China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, India, Germany, and the United Kingdom. These work groups take several different forms. The largest and most active work groups are those which are working on product of some sort. So I'll give you an example from Japan. I'll pick up one of the original products that they would bring to market and explain how that worked and why that was useful for Japan. So when it came to Japan, we kicked off case studies, and we had a whole bunch of case studies created from companies. Some of this text might be quite small, so I'll just zoom in perhaps. So we had companies like Fujitsu and Hitachi, Panasonic, Sony, Toshiba, creating very small case studies which they could talk to. And the first few months of the Japan work group meetings, perhaps the first 3 meetings, we focused on such case studies. So a quick example here, let's pull up a very basic one. So in this case, we have Fujitsu talking briefly about how they run their OSPO, dedicated, virtual, few people, a lot of people, and then a small amount of information about it. And the companies would give 5-minute presentations about what each of them was doing. And after a few meetings like this, when we talked about OSPOs, we talked about education, it became time to turn our attention to working on new material product. And that's where, for example, the Japanese work team put a lot of energy into building out information in things like a supplier leaflet. Here's the example of the supplier leaflet. This activity was led by Sony, but it was done by half a dozen more, I told a lie, more like a dozen companies. going through the various things about open source that suppliers might need to know, starting at the beginning, because a lot of suppliers had no knowledge. So it started off with case studies to create a baseline of where people were at. And then it moved into creating various work products to address common challenges. And, you know, I think that format worked pretty well. It's been very similar for Korea. It certainly is unfolding in a similar manner in the UK and India. And, you know, I would suggest that this work group potentially follows the same path. Short case studies in the next meeting, maybe the meeting after as well, to set a baseline of where we're at. And then we talk about stuff we can do together. So the goal, I think, to start with, should be to make sure that we can access each other's knowledge as effectively as possible. And the activities should probably kick off with explanatory case studies to give a snapshot of where we're at, and then move on to common work product. But I wanted to pause and see if you had any thoughts or ideas about what you'd like to see from the North American work group.
Hi, Shane. It's Gurbir. I hope you remember we were having quite a few calls when we were setting up the India work group. And yeah, it's great to be here. I remember writing you a few emails when I moved to Canada. So I'm working with this IP firm, and I have been scavenging to find some work around open source, but there hasn't been many. It's mostly academic that I could find. And when I was reporting, and the India working group is doing amazing right now. We have around 20 to 25 companies, and we get things, and it's a pretty regular meetup groups, and so things are amazing there. I'm still in touch with Mishi. She has been super helpful, and it's her firm who is spearheading the further meetups. So I was hoping that if we could do something similar, because sharing knowledge, as you were talking about, has been tremendously helpful for the companies, for us to bring more companies in the India work group. Because as they were sharing their case studies, as they were sharing their concerns, and sharing their knowledge, it helped other new entrants who we could bring in conformance. You might remember we started conversation with Wipro, so that was the company that we were looking forward, and there's some interesting news coming from that side. So I was hoping that knowledge sharing would be right, but creating more awareness and reaching out to these tech companies. They have their own in-house open source departments, but there isn't a lot happening. It's just if there's any integration requirements they have, so someone could work on those licenses, but that's about it. So I'm not so sure about US. So Mishi does tell me that yes, there are interesting things happening there, but in Canada, I think there could be a lot more beyond universities that people can benefit from open source.
A very good point. By the way, I hope you're enjoying Canada.
Our car almost skid through the snow today, but otherwise it's been fine. I found some really good mentors, and I'm doing my master's program in IP, and I'm working at this firm. So yeah, things have been extremely welcoming. Yeah, Mishi has been super helpful. So, yeah, it's been all good. Thank you for that.
You're welcome. Yes, let's try to make sure that support is in place. To this point, I suppose for this meeting, the main support infrastructure I can give you right now, before we start sharing our case studies in the next meeting or a couple of meetings, and before we work on common work product, we should probably take a moment to talk about what does the ISO development mean for you? So going right back to the OpenChain project itself, we have a lot of information from companies in our ecosystem that it was very important for the ISO number that we've just obtained. And a lot of the companies wanted to have this ISO number 5230 to place into sales and procurement, particularly into procurement negotiations and procurement contracts. So one of the quips from the past of the OpenChain project was that we can replace 12 pages of bespoke contract language with one number. And that fundamental concept is both sound and now expected. I mentioned that some of the example companies which will explicitly be announcing conformance to the ISO standard include Toyota and Cisco in this week. And this momentum will carry through into January and beyond, where we have a sequence of companies planning to make public announcements about their adoption and therefore signaling their intent to their supply chain regarding this ISO standard. So the first thing that's going to happen to North America, whether you're in Canada or Mexico or the United States, is you can expect this ISO number to crop up in negotiations. You can certainly expect that a lot of the world's largest companies involved in open source will be actively leveraging this standard to simplify their supply chain. For those of you who might be new, here are the platinum members of the OpenChain project today. And we have another announcement later this week of another company, a major European telecommunications company. Our board members are a good example of the diversity and type of company that will be including OpenChain in negotiations. But of course, these board members are only a small subset of the community. Let me pull over to show you some of the scale we have. So, zooming in again, our main mailing list here has got over 3,800 subscribers. So in Germany, we've got 46, India 65 now, Japan 204. The Korean work group is at over 50, Taiwan 36, UK is still small, only 16. Areas like automotive, we're already scaling quite well, 125. So we have, with these individuals, on average, we have 2 individuals to 1 company engaged. That's the baseline average, what you see. In automotive, it's a little bit different. There's more of a bias towards 1 person, 1 company. But there's a lot of people out there. There's a lot of companies out there, and a lot of people are well positioned to push OpenChain into their supply chain pretty soon. As you can gather from the scale of our main mailing list, we have a lot of watchers, and they've been waiting for this ISO release. So, how soon can you expect OpenChain to be required if you're a supplier? It depends on the industry. The feedback we've had is that for certain areas in the industry, like consumer electronics, where the sales cycles are fast, OpenChain is more likely to move quickly into supplier negotiations as something to be done now. In other industries where there's a long tail, such as automotive, the indications are that the companies will be growing towards this object at roughly the same pace as other procurement cycles in the industry. As a side note, I saw we have, I think, Russ on the line. Hi, Russ. A lot of background there with open source and automotive in the US with Russ. And, you know, I think it would be accurate if I said, Russ, that the supplier negotiations occurring today regarding OpenChain are going to be for product a couple of years down the line on deployment.
Correct. Yep. They're generally 18 months to 2 years out on development, and that would be faster development. unless it was R&D, which might be quicker, but in general, yes,
Yeah.
that's correct. Yep.
So, I mean, even with, let's say, Toyota actively announcing their adoption and pushing it into the supply chain, the suppliers will have probably a longer tail than, by way of example, suppliers to a company involved in making televisions or something similar.
True, and I would
Now,
say one other thing, Shane, is that if a supplier or even within the company internal, if they already had their processes in place or already following OpenChain and maybe just not certified, they might have a shorter lead time into that.
that's a good point, Russ. And we have had a few companies lurking, waiting for the ISO number, so that's what they would announce conformance to. Now, if people are lurking or looking at what to do, probably one of the most important messagings we have is that the project has created the standard over a period of 5 years or so in total. We've been in market since October 2016. We have groups for specification development. We have groups for conformance and so on and so forth. We have a steering committee for approving the standard. We have a governing board for overseeing the project. And actually, none of that changes with ISO. So when people are looking at what their expectations can be, it's exactly the same as what has happened before in developing and deploying this standard. The only real difference is that we have the ISO number. In the background, of course, some of our processes for submitting and updating the standard have changed, so that when OpenChain as a project updates the standard sometime in the future, not now, but when we do that, technically we'll take the updated standard to a committee and joint development foundation, which is our ISO submitter, and then they'll take it to ISO. But those additional steps are completely invisible to you and to users of the project. So I think we should message clearly that, OpenChain is, as always, open for business. It's easy to go in and adopt the standard if you so wish. You can self-certify, get help from partners. Indeed, we have lengthy webinars on each topic. Self-certification, independent assessment, and third-party certification have 1-hour webinars on each. We have extensive frequently asked questions. We're able to provide help to people on any topic. They can contact the project directly and then get redirected to the right direction. And like I said, we've got that enormous corpus of reference material to support people alongside our bi-weekly webinars, our bi-weekly calls, and so on. And of course, people can get a copy of the OpenChain specification off the website. As you probably know, when there's an ISO standard, you can obtain the ISO standard off the ISO website for a fee. And you can definitely do so. ISO 5230 is going to be available, or is already available. Let's see if they've published it yet. No, not yet. It's going to be available in a couple of hours. But OpenChain 2.1 is functionally identical, and that's freely available from our website at any point. So people can access a document which contains all the same requirements and the same wording of the requirements as the ISO standard from our website. There's no barrier to entry at all. And that's it. OpenChain's ready for business. It's ready for new companies. And we've done everything we can to make it as easy as possible to engage with us. One thing I'd love to do, one thing I'd love to encourage with the US is that perhaps we can do some webinars in our webinar series on North America specific topics to help people understand what's necessary in this geographic space. I've had some requests for us to do similar things about China and about Japan. And perhaps another thing we can do is we have a lot of interesting people in North America. Maybe we can add some of these people to the OpenChain interview series, which helps people get introduced to the community at large. One thing I would like to do at this juncture is, if it's okay, I would like to just ask Mark for a brief status update on how the specification is looking in terms of where it might go in the future. And it might sound strange to talk about that when we have just launched 2.1. Why are we talking about the future? The answer is that we want to make sure that every voice is always heard. So even though we've just launched a version of the standard, we want to make sure that any notes, suggestions, or comments are recorded and formally placed into future review cycles, regardless of how many months or years ahead we actually update the standard. So Mark, my impression is that we're looking pretty solid. We've had some good feedback, but we haven't had any major concerns, and mostly people are now looking at the potential of a future editing shuffle of sections and so on. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. So we did get some good feedback, but those are, I would say, more incremental, natural things you'd expect from people using the spec, that we kind of slowed down a little bit because we were waiting for this day to come. And now that it's here, we can resume this activity a little bit more progressively. The idea would be to start up in January, more actively continue gathering up the feedback and discussing the different issues. There are several ways people can submit that. You could either participate in the live meeting. You can submit a comment to the mailing list, if that's, or you can post it as a issue on the GitHub repository for the spec. And finally, if you really want to maintain, anonymity, you can actually just email me, and I'll take your feedback and hold you anonymous to that. But you have multiple different ways to communicate feedback, and you will have an opportunity to participate live if that's what you want to do in our regular bi-monthly meeting.
One thing that's been really good to note has been that we've actually had very few actual changes to the specification proposed. A lot of it has been about interpretation or polishing. This is,
yeah. I would say the one thing that struck us was the possible ordering of topics, because there was suggested a slightly better flow of reading the document, but that didn't really necessarily materially change the requirements that currently exist.
Yeah, I was just looking at oh yes. One thing that did come up was the idea of scope as well. This is quite an old comment though, from Andrew Katz in 2019, which, if I recall correctly, we basically, when it came to scope of the project and of the specification, it's like, we'll talk about this for the next revision. So I guess this is one of those things we start chatting in January and essentially give everyone a floor to talk about what they think the appropriate scope 2021, 2022, 2023 is. We've had some requests, Mark, over time about increasing our engagement with security or export control and stuff like that. Do you think those requests will continue post ISO, or do you think people will settle on what we have today?
Yeah, so at the base foundation of the spec, we have clearly compliance, open source compliance for licensing. And there were, to Shane's point, there have been a number of requests about possibly extending that to security, vulnerability management. So the idea here is that we're ultimately trying to build trust in the use of open source that's used in people's software. And clearly licensing trust is key, but people are starting to say, well, what about security management and using open source? So, and another one is potentially export. And the idea would be to have a kind of exploratory discussions on how we might extend the spec in a kind of an optional feature, right now we would assume that people always would start out with license compliance, because that's always, table stakes. You have to have compliance with all the licensing to use the open source. There's just no getting around that. But if you wanted to have an additional blessing from the open chain project on security, vulnerability, and people trusting your software, your open source software, then that's another opportunity for us to explore. But we will continue look at it as a exploratory task option, and then maybe have these side or options or appendix to the spec that you would not be necessarily required to match those or satisfy those, but they're there for you if you wanted to add that to your trust story around open source.
That's a good way to put it. And I think it's worth underwriting the fact that this is a conversation that we've got on the table because of huge market demand. So, in the United States, government agencies like NTIA are engaging with Linux Foundation via OpenChain, SPDX, and they're very interested in how we enable effective process management in open source. So for NTIA, their primary optic is security, right? So they want to use this in the security field. And it's similar in the UK, where the BSI, British Standards Institute, is interested in having further engagement with OpenChain for all aspects of open source, but particularly right now, they've got a new security committee. And again, if people meet the requirements of OpenChain, if they use something like SPDX for software bill of materials, they've closed a lot of the loop on most security issues with software. One thing, export control. Mark, is this something, export control, that Wind River has used OpenChain for in the past, or it's just an ongoing thing on your radar?
Well, we see it as one of several of those items that we need to check off, right? In order to release a product, we have to make sure that we're compliant with all the licenses, and we also have met the export compliance for a given jurisdiction. And so it's a natural complement to when we do the compliance of the licensing.
We've had people using OpenChain in merger and acquisitions as well, which has been interesting. That was actually the early parts of OpenChain being used. So pretty much directly after we saw uptick in people conforming, we saw uptick in people utilizing it during purchasing. Generally for compliance reasons and making sure everything was in order, but also for other reasons, such as if things aren't looking great at the company you're considering acquiring because they don't have open source processes in place. First of all, you can get them to fix that. Second of all, you can push down the price. So those very practical economics have helped drive OpenChain more deeply into the space. Just to reiterate to everyone, OpenChain as an ISO standard, so OpenChain 2.1, ISO 5230, is not going to be iterated rapidly. It's important that people know that this standard is going to be in market for a long time. And this version, 5230 2020, will both be used for a long time and permanently available. So just think of it in the same way as quality assurance standards like 9001 or 14001. I've had some iterations in their history, but the fundamentals are there. And if people are working on adopting OpenChain 5230 2020 today, that will be something that they can work on, adopt, and use for many, many years ahead. The discussion that Mark and I are having is really about making sure that voices are heard regarding what they'd like to see in the future. And that's part of the reason we're an open project with an open standard. Anyone can join in at any time. Go ahead, Mark, sorry.
So let me, can I put up a slide real quick?
Sure. I'll just turn off my share.
Just real quick. People can, and this will allow people to get a sense of where we're thinking of things might go, to your point a little earlier. Can you see the slide? Are you able to see it?
No problem.
Yeah, okay. So this is just a little bit more of a visual of what we were talking about earlier about expanding the opportunities around trust and open source. Currently, right now, community engagements is inside the core spec, and it's fine right now there, but it could likely also be treated like an optional piece because people are really worried about inbound and using open source and making sure that an organization can be trusted around their use of it. And there may not be as hard of a requirement that they have certain disciplines around engaging the community, although some might. So that could potentially be an optional piece in the future, along with security, export. And the other topic was functionally safe software. And that's where you're using a lot of open source to build functionally safe solutions. And in that case, you need to make sure that you're certifying your open source with respect to functionally safe requirements. If you're not familiar with that, then that's fine. But people that are in the aerospace and defense world, for example, or medical device world, that's something that's more relevant to them. So I just wanted to give that quick visual.
I think that was a really useful one to have up on the screen. So yeah, speaking of defense, I've noticed more and more defense companies circling OpenChain recently. So that's been interesting. I guess that's an indication of the relationships we're building with government agencies, plus important suppliers working on OpenChain. So the next thing I'd like to pause and look at is actually how do we build all this infrastructure? Because there's a lot of stuff out there. One thing that's been very interesting recently has been our self-certification. So people go to our website and they choose to adopt the standard, and then they go to our web app. They have this self-certification available, and it's in a whole bunch of different languages, plus all previous versions of the spec. And we have a combination of activities around OpenChain where we have some people helping us out as contractors, and we have some people helping us out as volunteers, and we have some people who are both at different times. So one person who deserves huge credit for the self-certification questionnaire that you can use today for the ISO standard is Gary O'Neill, who's also on the line. Hey, Gary, how are you doing?
Doing good, Shane. Thanks. Thanks for the shout out too. Appreciate it.
You've been fantastic, absolutely amazing getting us ready for the ISO version of the standard in these languages. What people probably didn't know and should know is that you've put in many hours over the weekend and so on, making sure that this runs smoothly and above and beyond. Thank you so much, Gary.
No problem.
Kind of a side question. This relates, I think, Gary, your customers are often looking at open source compliance support. They're trying to understand the problem and work out their ways to do it, and maybe you're providing some tooling or other types of technical support to them as well. Would that be a correct assessment?
Yeah, we provide Source Auditor, which is the company that I co-founded with my marketing partner, Korak Mitra. We provide consulting ranging from policy through implementation. One of my favorite tasks is more technical. Writing code is a lot of fun for me, but we do get involved in a lot of policy as well. What we don't do is legal advice. I leave that up to some of our lawyer partners to provide the legal advice. But I've been involved with OpenChain almost from the beginning. And, you mentioned earlier, Shane, the due diligence. I started doing that almost immediately. About 2/3 of my business is due diligence. And I was using OpenChain pretty much as a script to make sure that we were following all the right processes. So it's been a great partnership with the OpenChain community.
Oh, it's been great to work with you too, and you've been involved with SPDX for many years as well, so you know everything about how this evolved. And I noticed we've got a few other partners on the line too. So we've got McCoy Smith, who of course has deep experience both on the legal side and on the project management side. And welcome, McCoy. How are things with you?
They're good, thank you.
If I recall correctly, you're based in Portland, is that right?
Yes, I am.
Is this space in the economics of Portland with the current coronavirus issue, have companies pulled back a bit in what they're doing? Are we seeing retrenchment? By way of example, in Japan, we've seen a huge upheaval in what companies are planning for the future. Fujitsu announced that half their workforce would work remote permanently, which is very unusual. So companies are in the midst of a lot of reorg.
Yeah, it's a little hard for me to tell, and it kind of depends on the company. I mean, the work from home thing is the wave of the future, I believe. I'm not sure it affects OpenChain all that much, or OpenChain conformance. But I seem to be having a big uptick in work coming in the past month. So that seems to be at least an indication that the effects of lockdowns and continued health issues is perhaps waning. I don't know.
It's an interesting observation. So for instance, in OpenChain as a project globally, this pandemic has had zero impact in our growth.
Yeah.
We've been fairly linear in where we're going. We haven't gone to events, and now what we've learned is that mostly we don't need events. So that was the main takeaway.
Yeah, I think the world of events is going to be quite different in the future. I mean, Shane, you and I and others have done any number of virtual events. I think that may be how events are primarily done in the future, just because of the travel costs, etc. I'm not sure how they do with the network, what we're going to deal with the networking part, because it's not quite the same networking over Zoom as it is in person, but we shall see.
One thing I've noticed is that we're hitting the limits of platforms. For example, when we use event platforms, quite frequently it's a little clunky to move between talks. And then when we use just video conferencing platforms, we often hit attendee limits. So we're trying to find that mix that allows people to huddle and see the talks they want and so on and so forth.
I think the kinks in that'll get ironed out eventually. I think the first virtual conference I went to was Libra Planet, which was March or April of last year. So it literally went from a in-person to a virtual conference in 2 weeks.
Ooh.
And that was very clunky the way that it ran. I mean, it ran reasonably well considering how little time they had to adjust. But conferences that I've attended recently have been a lot smoother in the way that they've run in the virtual world. So, another year of this and we'll all be expert in presenting over Zoom, I think.
Probably.
Or whatever platform, you use. I don't want to limit us to one particular proprietary vendor. Obviously, Big Blue Button and Jitsi, and there's a whole bunch of them, and they're all options.
One of the big things for the OpenChain project was to find video solutions that would work globally. because a whole bunch of the
Yeah.
solutions don't work in China, for example.
Yeah.
But Zoom does. So that's why we landed on Zoom as our default. We have a lot of large Chinese companies in the OpenChain community. One of our board members is Oppo, which is one of the world's largest handset makers. But we have, all the usual suspects, whether you're talking about Baidu or Huawei, are all engaged with us via our China work group. And this North America work group is getting started partially because we don't have events. We never had a North American work group because basically we would all get together about 4 or 5 times a year at the major conferences and have a chat there. But we don't expect that to normalize for a long time. So the prediction I've got for the OpenChain project is that at the very earliest, some travel might be possible in Q3, more likely Q4, if then. With the vaccine, it's going out right now. The United States will have 3 million doses. It needs 370 million just to get started. The United Kingdom has the priority on that vaccine. It needs over 60 million doses. In total, we need 8 billion doses of vaccines. And there's no production runway that shows the majority of that being ready before Q3 2021. So I don't actually foresee OpenChain being at or hosting physical events for the most part until the very tail end of next year. So that's how we're going to run things. We're going to run things virtually, and we're going to try and make sure that we have good speakers and good content for you. Speaking of good speakers and good content, we've had a lot of success with our user company community in holding our bi-weekly webinars. And we've also had a lot of success in holding webinars throughout the year and last year with various partners. So I noticed that we have Matt Jacobs from Synopsys on the line. Matt, I'm not sure how many times myself or Dave Marr spoke on your webinars, but I think it must be about 4 times in the last 12 months.
And always appreciated. So thank you for that. It's a topic that is always in high demand, and I think will continue to be. A few things that have been said so far, I totally concur with. The movement to virtual has been a little bit clumsy, but I think we've run a couple of great programs with tremendous audience participation. So I see good things there. I also think it'll be interesting to see as this thing gets out into the world and starts getting used, how it pushes down in the supply chain. We're seeing smaller companies coming to us, not the big ones, wondering about it. So it'd be good to start getting some traction with smaller companies as well, and it's going to happen organically, I think.
It's a good point. And one of the big reasons that we're doing things in reordering our website and trying to make it super simple to arrive and super simple to find out webinars and to meet the community is to try to make sure there's a friendly face here and people don't just land and see massive multinationals and think, oh boy, which has been a real front of mind activity for us. And when you look at our conformance nowadays, these are some example programs of companies that have publicly announced that they're conforming. And you'll see some of them are really unique, like the very last one, Neoma Bank, is an ethical bank in Myanmar. And these organizations, Neoma is actually relatively big, but on the software side and their software team, that's tiny. But they came to OpenChain because they didn't want to replicate. They wanted good processes. Same reason that we have, for instance, Philip Morris engaged with the OpenChain community and actively contributing. So, yeah. Hypothetically then, what do you think? A couple of people potentially willing to do a 5-minute case study on the next call in about 2 months? Even if no one volunteers, I'm going to hunt you down. I'm going to catch you people and make you do it. Here's my basic idea. We have another call in 2 months. On that call, we're going to have, say, 5 short case studies. Each case study will be like 5 minutes long. We'll be basing it on what the Japanese companies did when they were focusing on their case studies to get the conversation started. So, you know, everyone talks very briefly about one topic. And let's say we start with the OSPOs to see what OSPOs look like in the OpenChain community. And some companies might use their company name and some might be anonymous. Here's an example of an anonymous company in Japan, which talked about what they do. And we will do 5 of those, set the context for OSPO 2021. And from there, we'll build out on what do the OSPOs need with OpenChain and more broadly on their open source governance. We may do another series of case studies 2 months later, or if people immediately identify work products where we need something to help make things better, we'll do that. Does that general approach work for you, or would you like us to take a different approach? All righty. For those of you who are new to OpenChain, silence means everyone totally agreed, and that's what we're doing.
As long as they all keep referencing ProText, I'm happy to see them.
Yeah, this is where we're going to enter into the interesting phase with so many different people using either bespoke or vendor supplied tooling or Excel spreadsheets. We're going to have a full range of things here. And the Excel spreadsheets, by the way, everyone, is not a joke. Toshiba, Hitachi, and Fujitsu made a subset of SPDX, software bill of materials, called SPDX Lite, with the explicit goal of making it simple to utilize it in spreadsheets to talk to certain suppliers in Japan that prefer to use Excel spreadsheets to describe their bill of materials. So that actually became part of SPDX 2.2, the software bill of materials standard, which has been submitted to ISO. SPDX 2.2 is scheduled to graduate from ISO in Q2 2021. If you're not familiar with this software bill of materials, don't worry, you'll catch up on it on the next meeting. But long story short, one way to ingest and export all the key information about software, a standard that has been out there for about 10 years in our community, is gaining traction and will be the second ISO standard from LF after OpenChain. But that's a discussion for another day. We'll get them to present the next talk. And a lot of the tools out there, the companies working on tools or the open source tools already have support for SPDX or some degree of it or are working on it. Again, discussion for another day. So that's it. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for making time. Thank you for sitting in on the first meeting. If you have any other business, you can jump in now. If not, I will wish you a wonderful holiday season. Please take it easy. OpenChain will be winding down a lot of our activity on the 18th. That's our last full day of activity. We come back on the 4th of January. In between that time, if people need urgent help, they can get it. But we're having a 2-week hiatus for meetings and other kind of activities like that. So please have a lovely holiday season. You'll see the press releases going live shortly about ISO and about Toyota's conformance. And your support in echoing those and echoing the value of OpenChain is deeply appreciated. So take care, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Shane.
Thank you, Shane.
Thank you.